of journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm David Reed. The U.S. Secretary of State met with China's president and foreign minister in Beijing on Wednesday, and reporters say Hillary Clinton's visit was dominated by China's escalating territorial disputes in the seas of Southeast Asia. China is clashing with Japan over a small grouping of energy-rich islands in the East China Sea that separates the two countries. China is also clashing with the Philippines and 5 other governments that claim ownership of sections of the South China Sea. More broadly, the conflicts seem to be forcing the United States to take sides against China, and that's heightening tensions between the superpowers. Joining us on Global Journalist are 2 experts on the region. Sheila Smith is a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's on the phone from Washington. Martin Fackler is the Tokyo bureau chief of the New York Times. He's been covering the China Sea issues with a focus on the relationship between China and Japan, and he's in Kyoto getting ready for a conference there. It's early in the morning there. Welcome to Global Journalist.
Hello, David.
Thank you.
So much has happened since Hillary Clinton was last in China back in May. I wondered if Sheila, if you could kind of put these maritime disputes in kind of a historical context, starting with the relationship with China and Japan over these islands that they can't even agree on the right name for.
Sure. The Japanese call them the Senkaku, and the Chinese call them Daioyu. The islands are 5 small little islets. They're not inhabited. They're just off Okinawa Prefecture, which is the stream of islands at the very southwestern end of Japan.
Right.
The dispute between China and Japan dates from the 1970s. The United States controlled Okinawa up until 1972. And when it negotiated returning these islands to Japan, China protested. It said that these islands had originally been Chinese and that the United States had no right to give them to Japan. But the other factor that's important in this dispute is at the end of the 1960s, the United Nations had an economic committee full of scientists who had done surveys in the East China Sea. And they came back basically arguing that the area around the Senkakus, a much broader area, but the area that was under dispute probably had a very vast resources of oil, hydrocarbon resources, so oil and gas reserves. So there's an economic dimension to this from the very beginning in the 70s.
And Martin, tell us about what kind of sparked this latest flare-up in this long-running dispute.
Well, David, I think it's kind of a, to try to find the beginnings is a bit of a chicken and egg sort of issue. But
Can we start with the one of the dynasties? No,
right.
Of the past few months. Yeah.
I would say the broader beginning would be this clash 2 years ago over the Chinese trawler captain who was arrested after his ship rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. And it set off this kind of, sort of prickliness, and I think in Japan an awareness of that China was more and more assertive presence, and a feeling in Japan that Japan had to defend its interests more and to do more to claim sovereignty. So that's kind of the broader background.
Right.
But the more proximate cause and the more immediate cause actually has been activists from both sides, not the national governments. I would say the most recent round probably began with Tokyo Governor Ishihara Shintaro's idea of buying 3 of the islands in the chain. The islands are actually owned by a private citizen, a Japanese national who lives in suburban Tokyo. And Governor Ishihara wanted to buy them because he wanted to make a stronger assertion of Japanese claims, and basically it was a criticism of the current government as being too weak-kneed on foreign policy. And Ishihara's plan was to build some sort of structures on the islands and make a stronger Japanese claim. And this set off a chain of events, one of the biggest of which was 14 Chinese activists from Hong Kong who staged a landing on one of the islands in August. 7 of them actually made it onto the island. All 14 were arrested, not arrested. They were detained and then deported. And the deportation was significant because it was Japan's effort to defuse things. I mean, the national governments actually have been fairly calm relative to these activists who keep sort of stirring things up. And then on the Japanese side, on the Japanese side, the deportation of the Chinese prompted a small flotilla of fishing boats from an island called Ishigaki to go to the Senkaku Daioyu Islands. Something like 100 or 150 people are on board these vessels. Of them, a very small number actually landed on one of the islands and, wave flags and this sort of thing, which prompted China to respond in a way. But it's interesting because, again, it's been driven by activists and local politicians and whatnot. It's not really the national governments who are going at each other in this particular case.
Right.
And in fact, I would say the opposite. I'd say that Tokyo has been trying, and Beijing as well, have been trying not to let this thing blow up. Tokyo now wants to buy the islands instead of, the national government now wants to buy these islands instead of the Tokyo government.
Yeah.
And that's an effort, I think, to diffuse things because the national government does not want to build structures or do anything to provoke China. I think they actually want to basically find a way to maintain the status quo, which at this point is probably the least confrontational alternative.
And Sheila, as since you're not directly involved with the media, I might ask for your outside observation on this. When you're reading these developments, and what are you noticing about the difference in coverage in China and Japan?
Well, it's interesting because I get invited to be on various media outlets, and I have been asked many times in the last week or so by China, by CCTV, their English station, by their reporters, magazines, as well as print media, to comment on this and what's going on in Japan, and what do you think about the central government, the national government of Tokyo is national government of Japan wants to purchase these islands to, again, as Martin said, keep it low key so it can control access to the islands more effectively. So there's a lot of Chinese interest in trying to interpret what's going on in Japan. There's also, I think, a significant amount of Chinese media attention to the fact that these latest series of incidents has produced a lot of demonstrations in China and a fairly, strong domestic debate that's very anti-Japanese. So I sense in the media coverage by the Chinese that are approaching me, for example, that they really want a kind of analytical perspective. They want to calm it down, give it some logic, talk it through a little bit more. On the Japanese side, I think the media is, let's just say in the spring when Governor Ishihara came to Washington and made the speech at the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank here in D.C., the Japanese media was somewhat skeptical. Mm-hmm. And they said, basically if the governor had made that speech in Tokyo, it probably wouldn't have got as much attention as it did. But because he made the speech in Washington, it seemed to up the ante a little bit. And again, I agree with Martin's interpretation of Ishihara's motivation. He really did want to, and very publicly stated, that he thought the central government was weak, and he wanted to provide a more robust defense of the Senkaku Islands against Chinese intrusions.
Okay.
So the media has played a kind of, I think in both cases, I'm somewhat surprised by the kind of tone that I'm hearing in my interaction with the media. But inside both countries, I think there's a tendency to highlight this issue as a test of sovereignty, and a kind of, this is not all or nothing, but there's a little bit of a, just how far does this need to go? Inside Japan, I find there is today a mood of vulnerability and a certain amount of conservative exploitation of that public mood. And I would say that that's a little bit the tone and the tenor of the media coverage that I'm hearing in Japanese.
Vulnerability because China's getting to be so much more dominant
Exactly.
Yeah.
That this is a China, and in fact, I'm just finishing up a book on this. That this is a rising China. It's a China that over the last decade, successive Japanese governments, conservative and liberal reform as well, have had a very hard time managing. There's been a lot of episodes of contention, from the controversial, issue of Yasukuni shrine visits by Prime Minister Koizumi back early 2000s to East China Sea issues, to resource issues, to gyoza, food poisoning emanating from imports from China, and then this latest Senkaku series of tensions. So I think you have a public in Japan that's much more sensitive to its own vulnerability to this rising China.
Right. And Martin, would you agree about the coverage being somewhat toned down and trying to avoid escalation?
Yes, I would agree, Sheila, because it's interesting. I think the governments have been trying in this most recent round not to let things escalate, and I don't think that emotions are being driven by major media, at least not in Japan. I don't watch China as closely, but in Japan, I don't get the sense that the major media are behind it. What's interesting from a media perspective is I think a lot of the emotions are taking place on new media, on the internet, on chat rooms. This vulnerability that Sheila correctly pointed out, I think it expresses itself on, they have these chat rooms in Japan, the most popular which is called Nichanaru, which is it's like young, people in their 20s and 30s who are basically sounding off about, angrily about China, and there can be a very sort of nationalistic and emotional mood on these things. And so I think it's interesting how that it seems to be more in that space where you get a lot of the emotions. It's not the government. It's not the main media. It seems to be almost taking place on a parallel track somewhere else. But I don't think that Japan's looking for a confrontation. I don't think that the Noda government, the government of Prime Minister Noda, is looking for a confrontation, and I don't get the sense that China is looking for a confrontation. I think it's being driven by, as Sheila said, these emotional feelings in the population. In Japan, this sense that the regional balance of power is shifting, and not only is Japan in decline, but Japan's protector, the United States, is also in relative decline. And that not only is China rising, but you have a more self-confident South Korea, you have a return of Russia, and that maybe Asia's entering a period where you have a redrawing of lines and you have a redrawing of relationships. And so I think there's a real anxiety in Japan on that side. And I think on the Chinese side, my feeling from talking with my Chinese colleagues is that the Senkaku, Daioyu Islands are they're probably much more emotional I guess they're emotional on both sides, but in China, the emotions have a lot to do with history, in the sense of the islands are seen as kind of the first step of Japan's aggression towards China a century ago.
Right.
When you hear sort of the Chinese presentation of the problem, it's usually that these islands were the first thing that Japan sees before then seizing Taiwan and then moving into China and so on and so forth. So they're seen as kind of a first step of Japanese imperialism, and the fact that Japan hasn't relinquished the islands, this is the Chinese view, right?
Right.
Is then seen as a sign that somehow Japan is unrepentant, that somehow we get back to this idea that Japan hasn't apologized, which, I mean, it really has apologized, but you get this notion that because Japan hasn't relinquished these islands, what really is at stake is Japan's view towards history, right? And somehow Japan hasn't really, come to terms with the pain that it inflicted on China. So I think that's why these, bird-dropping covered rocks out in the middle of the ocean become such an important issue. I mean, it is about energy, as Sheila mentioned. There is that aspect. But I think it's about history and grievance and a sense of past wrongs, that really becomes very, very powerful and very volatile. And that's sort of the risk that we have with this issue, is that volatility.
Right. And let's bring the United States into this. The United States has a treaty to defend Japan if there's any problems, and I think it came out and said it's not taking sides on this issue, but then I think they referred to the island by the Japanese name. So What's I guess Sheila, first from your point of view, what's at stake for the U.S. and what can the government do to help and not to hinder this dispute?
Well, I think, first of all, the State Department's position on the dispute over the sovereignty of the islands is that the United States doesn't take sides in the dispute itself. But you saw in the crisis of 2010, where you had the fishing trawler captain that ran into the Japanese Coast Guard vessels and was arrested. In that management of that sort of escalating diplomatic confrontation between Tokyo and Beijing, you had the foreign minister of Japan at the time, Maehara Seiji, meet with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and she reiterated the fact that the United States understood that these islands were under Japanese administration, and therefore they fell under Article 5 protections of the bilateral security treaty between the United States and Japan. Now, that was not the first time the U.S. government had pointed that out publicly. Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage had done that when he was working in the Bush administration. Well, but 2 points on this that are probably pretty important to share, and one is that Japanese, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, have long sort of chafed under that interpretation by the United States. In other words, that the U.S. was an ally, but they didn't take a position on the dispute. And part of that is because if you go back to right after World War II, and the San Francisco Peace Treaty that the United States guided through the process with a number of other states that allowed Japan, again, to regain sovereignty. The islands were part of Japan then, and the United States said that they were part of Japan when they reverted them back to Japanese sovereignty. So there's a kind of frustration, I think, among Japanese diplomats that the United States takes this rather vague, we don't take a side in the dispute, although historically the United States certainly did acknowledge this was Japanese territory. Similarly, when you talk to Chinese, you get a kind of reversal. Several of the interviews that I did over the last couple of weeks with the Chinese television, they said, why are the Americans dedicated to stirring up this problem between Japan and China? So they perceived the United States as a very active participant, and they referred to military exercises that our military had been doing with the Japanese, which was an island defense amphibious landing exercise.
Recently, yeah. That was fairly recently, right?
This was interpreted, right, as some kind of direct intervention by the United States. So again, the American role is very sensitive here on both sides.
And Martin, you recently, in an article, mentioned that Japan is redrawing its national defense strategy to push back at China. How is that happening?
Well, last year there was actually I guess 2 years ago, there was a significant redrawing of strategy. It's something that's been building for a long time, but it was presented as the shift from north to south. And it got a lot of play in the local media as the sort of dramatic rethinking of military strategy. And basically the idea was that Japanese military thinking had been still in the Cold War, that they had focused a lot of ground troops and tanks and heavy weapons in Hokkaido, the northernmost island, to defend against an invasion from the Soviet Union, which of course hasn't existed for many years. So, and this was in a way a belated shifting of priorities where they would go towards a more mobile force, Navy, amphibious, and air-based, to defend to the south and to remote islands in the south. And this was, of course, very much directed at China. China is the only country that's really pressing against Japan in the south. I guess Taiwan is there as well, but they're not really as assertive. So there has been, I think, this shift in thinking in Japan towards trying to do more to defend its interests. And there's a broader, I think there's two sort of trends of thinking here. One is the notion that Japan, and this may be because of the anxiety, that Japan needs to do more on its own. Traditionally, Japan had relied on the U.S. to do things, that relied on the American nuclear umbrella, and these sorts of things, and had taken a very low profile in diplomatic issues and in national security issues. And I think you're seeing more and more calls for Japan to do more, and it can be in the context of the U.S. alliance, where Japan, for example, will share more of the responsibilities, or it can also be presented as Japan acting on its own and increasing its own capability. So that's something that you're definitely seeing here, which is kind of a rethinking of that Japan no longer has the luxury, in a sense, of just sort of sitting back and letting the U.S. take care of things. That the world has changed, and that Japan has to find a way to stand up for itself, and that's what drives a lot of these activists to speak, because they feel that Japan's too passive. Japan can't say no. It can't speak its mind. And so when you read the domestic sort of narratives about what's happening, they're usually presented as Japan has to stand up to the world. It has to make itself known. The other interesting thing that you see, especially with conservatives in Japan, is a feeling that the U.S. won't be there in a dispute over the islands. I see over and over again in, like, for example, the weekly tabloids, which are in some ways a good way to get insight into at least how middle-aged Japanese men are thinking. But the emotional buttons that the tabloids are pushing tend to be, the Chinese are challenging us, the Chinese are kind of mocking us, making fun of us, and the Americans won't be there to protect us. That they're not going to protect the Senkakus for us, and we need to do it on our own. And so you are getting, I think, a shifting feeling in Japan of what they need to do and what their position is. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that Japan is, trying to revive its imperial ambitions or anything. It's nothing like that. But I think it's rather just a feeling that Japan needs to do more to protect what it already has, to protect its current lines, if you will, the territorial lines. And at the same time, it needs to be more assertive on its own. So it's an interesting sort of trend that's still unfolding.
Now, before we continue our discussion, I want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcasts at globaljournalist.org. You can also find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. This week we have an interactive map of the South China, or both the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and an interactive timeline of flare-ups in the long-standing dispute. So please send us questions or comments via globaljournalist@kbia.org, or you can go to our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter at GJJournalist. Now, the one thing I wanted to ask you about these scenarios. What if some Chinese activists plant the flag, so to speak, on this island and try to occupy it and force the issue? What do you see as happening then?
Well, they have done that already, and this is the landing a couple of weeks ago of the activists that Martin was describing. It's not the first time that you've had activists land on the island in the past.
Well, what if they become more aggressive and just decide they'll stay?
They'll stay. What's changed, I think, is the Japanese response. In the past, the Japanese Coast Guard has tried to deal with people. There's been incidents in the past where Taiwanese activists, for example, somebody drowned years ago. So the Japanese are very sensitive to the fact that something could go wrong inadvertently, right, in the interactions. These are islands that are, far, far away from any other piece of land. This last incident, the Japanese government put police on the ground, in addition to the Japanese Coast Guard circling and surrounding the waters. To date, the Japanese Coast Guard has not had the authority to arrest. They can stop, they can inspect, but they don't have policing authority on land, which is an interesting administrative sort of barrier here to the thinking about this issue. So there's a law currently in the Diet that suggests that the Coast Guard be given that authority to act as police on remote islands, so that if the Coast Guard has a problem somewhere, it does actually have the constitutional or the legal authority to arrest people. But they put the police and they put immigration officials on the islands a couple of weeks ago when these activists were heading there. And they got arrested and they got deported, as Martin said. What I worry about is two things. One is the incident in 2010 with the Chinese fishing trawler captain was probably the most egregious Chinese action vis-a-vis a Japanese Coast Guard vessel to date. He rammed two separate ships. Some people say he was drunk, others say he wasn't. It's not very clear. But in any case, on the high seas, the behavior was quite provocative. On this incident with activists, what you have the potential for is some kind of harm to come. Somebody drowns, somebody dies in the context of one of these incidents. And then I think the emotional reaction, both in China and in Japan, is going to be much, much more intense. So the Coast Guard, I think, have their work cut out for them. They have to be very calm in the management of these incidences, and the Japanese police and others will probably be put on the scene to help, like they were before. The bigger challenge is going to be the question of when the Coast Guard is going to be insufficient to deal with an incident. And then, again, as long as we're talking about citizen activists or the fishing trawler captain or some, civilian fishing vessels, Japan's Coast Guard is quite capable of dealing with it. China, however, has its version of regional coast guards. It has fishery patrol ships. It has other kinds of kind of paramilitary forces, so they're not the Navy, but something lesser, that are armed, and they're getting more and more willing to go into the waters around these disputed islands, go through them, test the Japanese Coast Guard on the open seas to see what the response is. So I think you're getting a slightly more, not provocative, but you're getting a slightly more higher potential for something to go wrong.
Right.
And I think that's the piece that both the Japanese policymakers are looking at, as well as what Washington in the background is looking at. And the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has invited China to begin maritime confidence-building dialogues. So these would involve local authorities, the Coast Guards, the fisheries survey ships, the other various administrative authorities in China to come to the table and talk about how do we avoid an incident so the lives aren't lost, and if something happens, we won't misinterpret each other's intentions. And I think that's a very positive initiative, and I hope that the Chinese government will pursue this more frequently.
Okay,
further with the Japanese.
In our final few seconds, Martin, what do you think the odds are that this could go bad, and that there could be a worst case scenario that's driven by this sort of the emotions and the nationalist feelings?
Well, I think, as Sheila said, that the risk is someone gets killed or something happens, and this sets off street demonstrations of this sort of thing. I would say that Japan and China did set up better sort of back channels after government-to-government back channels after the 2010 clash, so they have an effort to improve that. So there are positive signs as well.
Great. Well, now we've come to the end of this week's edition of Global Journalist, produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our program is directed by Travis McMillan, audio by Pat Akers. Raymond Tungakar is our executive producer. Ang Zhu is our lead producer. So join us next week for another Global Journalist. And thank you so much, Martin and Sheila, for being with us today.